Talked about this now. Some of you guys, when you did your project last unit, right? The second great awakening. Andrew did a thing where he talked about sinners in the hands of an angry God, and that's really in the colonial period. This comes in now in the 1830s. Okay. And what happens is you see this, the same thing as you see when we talked in the world history class about science and faith, really. Do you remember all the trial of Galileo and the problems that some scientists had with the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
Because they went against the church's teachings, right? So you see the same thing in America where you have people turning to science and churches and things like that, or the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, faith organizations, really feeling threatened because science challenges their beliefs and challenges their teachings. Okay? What you see now in the second great awakening is just more another turn to being more faith-based, being more religious, being more pious. It's not necessarily the same as what you saw in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where God is angry, God's going to kill you, you're walking over a bridge to hell, every step you take, that board could fall out and you're going to go down, right? This is the time where the Mormon Church is founded, okay, by a guy named Joseph Smith, who in, I believe it was Western Pennsylvania, said that he found new books that go to the Bible, and an angel came to him. The angel Malachi, it's one on top of the chapel in Salt Lake City, and basically gave him all these rules, right? And because it was a new faith, and because it was a different take on really traditional Christian religion, they're booted out of Pennsylvania, out of New York. They go to Illinois, they get booted out of Illinois, and then they end up traveling to Salt Lake City, right? Which is really the frontier, and they stayed there. At the same time, this focus on the individual and individual control leads to multiple social reforms. Okay? So the idea is that the difference now between the first Great Awakening, really, and the second Great Awakening is this. The second one is more focused on individual action. Okay? And really that individual action as it plays on a larger scale. So you look at people making reform movements and having individual choices lead to a collective action. One of the big things is temperance. And I'll show you some pictures and stuff like that on temperance in a little bit. But temperance just means they want to ban alcohol. We talked about that a couple years ago. So you're looking at get rid of alcohol because it ruins people's lives. And you see these movements, okay? And this temperance started really before we were a country. But the idea is if you drink too much, you're not going to be a good family man. Usually it's directed at men, right? You're not going to be a good family man. You're not going to be able to work. The devil comes out when you drink, things like that. And the movement kind of ebbs and flows. It gains steam and loses steam and all that stuff. It really culminates in the late 1920s, early 1930s with the adoption and the ratification of Prohibition. All right, and the amendment to the Constitution that banned alcohol, which is later repealed, or in the early 20s, I should say, that's repealed in the early 30s. That's a big movement, and people thought if you're going to cure society, what you need to do is stop having people drink, okay? And you'll hear stories, there's literally people who, mainly women, Andrew, stop, who would go to bars like in Kansas with an axe and literally chop up the bar. These people are pretty serious. You also see movements to have more of a universal education, right? A public education. A lot of these are focused in the north. Doesn't always catch on, but the idea is that the public should fund education and all you children should be educated. Where has it gotten us today? Welcome. You've been in school for a long time, both today and your life, okay? I mean, if you look back on your life, you're all what, 16, 17 years old? You've been in school for 10 years. 11 years. 12 if it's preschool. 13 if you're Brady. Anyway, that's a long time. You start when you're 6. Whatever. Maybe earlier for some. You also start to look at people start to study how they learn somewhat. More now than then, but you start to look at a bit of an individualization. You also have movements that are focused on women's right to vote, right? Women's suffrage. When you say suffrage, it means right to vote. And just really more equality for women, more expanded roles. These movements start, they don't accomplish a whole lot for a very long time. Okay? Now, you have abolitionists, okay? Someone who really focuses on ending slavery, okay? Many of the famous ones you think about, Frederick Douglass, right? Jim Brown, the Liberator, okay? Yep. You see now abolitionists calling for full emancipation. Emancipation just means freedom, right? You're granting someone their freedom. You know, full emancipation of slavery. Historically now, abolitionists in places like Massachusetts during the Revolutionary War advocated really for partial emancipation, meaning former slaves could be free but they couldn't vote, or they could be free but they couldn't own land. They could be free but they were restricted to where they lived, right? So some of these abolition groups call for the end of slavery and full emancipation, and others, more traditionally, call for gradual emancipation. In fact, Abe Lincoln, one of his first emancipation plans was for gradual emancipation. Never really got presented, but he said, you know what? When this war is done and we're freeing these slaves, we need to do it in a manner which kind of eases them back in. Because some people thought that if slaves are just thrown right in with full citizenship rights, the South would be a war zone. Eventually what happens is they're granted full emancipation right away, and it works out. Frederick Douglass, I had a picture of a very famous abolitionist, a guy who escaped slavery. I think they showed it in the video. They showed that in the video where he escaped slavery and had fake papers on the train and stuff like that. A very bright man becomes really an intellectual leader in the North and becomes very respected because he has the ability to publish his work. So he can put out newspapers and people read it. Somebody in here talked about the literacy rate during their last project, I think, right? I hope. Anyway, Frederick Douglass is a big name in the abolitionist movement. If you saw a picture of him, you probably remember his big white hair, right? And just looks very, very serious. So, we're good?
No.
Not yet? Now this sets us up for a bigger argument, okay? People in the North, they're split. And you can't, it's virtually impossible to argue that everyone in the North was morally opposed to slavery. They weren't. A lot of people didn't really care because it didn't affect them, right? I mean, if you ask people now about like the debt of our country, you know, we're in how many trillions of dollars of debt. I would imagine there's going to be a lot of people who you ask that say, well, I don't care, because it doesn't immediately affect them right now, right? Will it affect them later or their kids later? Probably, but it doesn't right now. So people in the North weren't all morally opposed to it. Some were. Some said this is completely wrong to own another human. Others didn't care. Some people didn't want to go to war with the South. We didn't have really good leadership, right before the Civil War. And that's kind of part of it, but they felt that this issue of slavery, which really masked more of an issue of power in our country, would drag us into war, because that's the big difference, right? Okay? This is a big one. Regardless of how you feel about it, Southern cotton and Southern agriculture feed Northern industry. That's like the gas that keeps the machine going, right? So without that, what's going to happen to industry in the North? Right? Really? But this is a big shot because it's going to affect a lot of people in the North if the factory shut down. They can't manufacture stuff, right? Okay. Now, in the South, what do you have? Well, yes. This is a big part of it. The South argued that slavery was their way of life. They argued it was their right. It's an institution. It's always been there. Why should we change it? To this day, I've got one of my close friends who coached me when I was in college, and I coached with him later on at a different college. But he's an English teacher, and I'm a history teacher. We'd sit down and talk about the Civil War. And he still, to this day, refers to it as the Northern War of Aggression. He won't call it the Civil War. He calls it the Northern War of Aggression, and he believes it. He's not the only one. Anyway, one argument was that slaves enjoyed their life, that they were kind of simpletons, that they didn't know any better, that they were well taken care of. And some people went on great lengths to put on a show that demonstrated that. Okay? In the end, what you have is an argument that centers on this. States' rights and federal rights. You can write that down. The argument centers on states' rights. So, the South argues that the federal government has absolutely no business threatening the institution of slavery, because whose decision is it? The states. It's the state's decision to allow it if they want to or not. Okay, and any action by the federal government that infringes on that is an overreach. The federal government says there are certain things that we all have to agree upon, and it's basically nullification. Let me put another word up here: nullification versus supremacy. Okay. So the states believe that if there's a law that's passed that they don't agree with at the federal level, they can do what? Nullify it, not follow it, right? And the federal government's saying, oh, no, probably doing this. If we pass a law, you have to do what? You got to follow it. So if these guys right, the South's right, and if they can nullify laws, what does that do to the power of this? I mean, it's gone, right? I mean, we're back with the articles where they had to ask for money. Make sense? Okay, so when you look at this, the argument of the Civil War being all about slavery, it's not all about slavery. Slavery masks some of these things, and we see it leading up to it, right? It's about political power, maintaining a balance of power. It's about who has the power here, states or the federal government, right? We still have these arguments today. You've got multiple states whose governors and attorney generals have sued the federal government and refused to implement the national health care law.
They want to nullify the law. They brought their argument before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't, and they upheld the law. But people still have they try to nullify it, right? It's the same thing. You see this all the time about state. Whose responsibility is it? Who has that right? States or the federal government? And it changes and goes from there.